In a world where youth is celebrated and age too often dismissed, one old man and his rusted truck carried a history too heavy to see and too sacred to sell. Henry Granger didn't wear medals. He didn't seek attention. But beneath the quiet surface of his flannel coat and weathered hands was a story of loyalty, loss, and a promise forged in fire and never forgotten. When a sleek Maserati tried to erase his past with arrogance and money, Henry didn't argue. He made a phone call, just one, and everything changed. What rolled into the sleepy town of Westfield that day wasn't just a convoy of black SUVs, it was memory arriving in silence. This isn't just a story about an old truck. It's about what we carry, what we protect, and what some men never stop standing for. Because sometimes the loudest legacy is the one that rumbles forward on four-worn wheels. Brandon leaned against the curb, arms crossed, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "It's just an old truck, old man," he scoffed, dismissing the decades of dents and rust as if they meant nothing. His voice was casual, mocking, but Henry didn't so much as blink. No anger, no retort. He didn't raise his voice, didn't flinch. He simply reached into his weathered jacket and pulled out a phone that looked like it belonged in a museum. The buttons were worn smooth, the screen cracked like spiderwebs. Yet his fingers knew their way. They moved with quiet confidence, like they'd been waiting, no, preparing for this moment all along. 15 minutes later, the quiet streets of Westfield fell into a hush as six black SUVs rolled into town, their engines barely making a sound. No flashing lights, no sirens, just quiet, deliberate power. The doors opened and the silence deepened. These weren't politicians, not lawmen, not even men of wealth. What stepped out of those cars was something heavier, something older. It was a debt owed, a promise kept, a memory too sacred to put a price on. Henry Granger didn't walk with swagger. He didn't need to. At 75, time had etched itself into the whinies on his face, drawn by war, wind, and years of honest labor. His movements were slower now, sure, but measured. There was a kind of steadiness to him, a gravity that even the young couldn't deny. In Westfield, Vermont, a small town tucked between the Golden Hills and back roads so quiet you could hear leaves fall, nobody needed to ask who Henry was. They all knew. They always had. Each morning, just after sunrise, Henry would climb into his rust-bitten 1970s Ford F-100. He called her Old Gracie. Folks figured the name belonged to someone from a long time ago, someone Henry didn't speak of, and no one dared ask about. Gracie wasn't much to look at. Her engine coughed and sputtered when she came alive, wheezing like a tired old smoker before finally settling into a low, steady purr. She didn't boast speed, she didn't beg for attention, but there was dignity in the way she moved, unapologetic and resolute, just like the man behind the wheel. To most, she was just a truck, but to Henry she was four wheels and a memory, his life on display in cracked leather and sun-faded steel. On the dashboard sat a yellowed photograph of a woman whose eyes still sparkled with laughter. Martha, his wife, his heart, his everything, for 41 years until cancer came quietly and took her away. Her seat remained unchanged, still bearing the soft shape of her presence, as though the truck itself remembered her voice, her humming to Willie Nelson on those long drives through the Green Mountains. And beneath that same seat was something sacred. A carefully folded American flag, stiff and faded from years of hiding. It had once rested atop a casket, a friend, a fellow soldier. A promise Henry had made long ago in the choking heat of Korea, and kept every day since. That morning was like most. Henry was on a delivery run. The bed of Old Gracie rattled with wooden crates, brimming with freshly picked Macintosh apples. Some were deep red like old wine. Others bore streaks of green and freckles like sunspots. Their scent filled the cab, sweet, crisp, mixing with the rich aroma of aged leather and motor oil. It was the scent of memory, of home. The road from his orchard to the church wound gently past fields dotted with leaning scarecrows and barns wearing coats of peeling paint. It was a road Henry knew by heart. Nothing too new, nothing too loud. Just the way he liked it. As he rolled up Main Street, the steeple of Westfield's old white chapel caught the morning sun like a beacon. He brought Old Gracie to a soft stop. A cluster of church ladies stood waiting, shawls wrapped tight around their shoulders, voices mingling in gentle laughter, low and knowing, the way only small-town women laugh. Henry stepped out, boots crunching on gravel. They didn't rush to greet him. They never did. They just smiled. And he smiled right back. "Brought the best of the orchard," he said, lifting a crate with a quiet ease that made him seem 20 years younger. Sister Lorraine stepped forward. She'd known Henry since he returned from the war. Her hand rested on his arm, warm and steady. "Still delivering more than apples, Henry." He gave a small nod, eyes lowered. Compliments always made him uneasy. As he climbed back into the driver's seat, ready to head home, a sudden noise drew his gaze. A clatter and a shout from the roadside. Two boys, maybe 10 or 11, crouched over a bike. Its front wheel bent, the chain hanging limp like a broken limb. Without a word, Henry eased old Gracie to the curb and stepped out. His knees cracked as he knelt beside them. "Looks like she threw her chain," he muttered, hands already moving. The boys watched silently, wide-eyed as Henry examined the gears. His hands were steady, experienced. Within moments, the chain was back in place, the wheel spinning true. "Try it now," he said, wiping his hands on an old rag tucked into his back pocket. One of the boys beamed, jumped on the bike, and pedaled away like he was flying for the first time. His laughter echoed down the road. Henry stood, back aching, but chest light. He watched the boy disappear into the morning sun. Sometimes the smallest things carried the most weight. And Henry Granger had always known how to carry what mattered. He walked back to old Gracie, resting his hand on her door like greeting an old friend. She wasn't shiny, not the kind of truck that turned heads or made people take pictures. But she carried his years, his yesterdays. She carried his promises. That was enough. In this small, quiet town, that was everything. Somewhere deep in his chest, something stirred. A memory. Dusty and distant, but never gone. A promise whispered in the smoke and heat of a faraway land, made when the future was uncertain and the present was fire and noise. A promise not yet asked to be fulfilled, but always carried, always ready. The air that morning had a sharpness to it, crisp and thin, brittle like leaves that crumbled underfoot. Autumn had no plans to linger. Henry could feel it in his bones, but he welcomed the cold. Clarity came with cold. No confusion, no haze, just truth. He drove old Gracie down the hill from the church, her tires humming a tune of age and comfort. The road curved and dipped like an old friend's hand, familiar in every rut and rise. He had just enough apples left in the crate for Mrs. Coig over on Maple, and a few more stops before lunch. The day was falling into its usual rhythm, but he wouldn't make it that far. Near Dunlin Ridge, where the road narrowed and maples lined up like curtains about to part for a stage, the stillness split wide open. First came the sound, not the rustle of leaves, not the rumble of a truck. This sound was too clean, too smooth. A predator's purr, built for speed, built for showing off. Then the flash, a sleek blade of silver slicing through morning mist, tires flinging wet leaves in its wake. A Maserati, low, hungry, too fast for the bend, too careless. The man behind the wheel wasn't watching the road. One hand on the wheel, the other on his phone, eyes flicking up just in time to register Henry as a nuisance, not a person, just something in his way. Henry yanked the wheel hard right. Gracie groaned in protest, her tires grinding against the loose edge of gravel, fighting for a grip that wasn't there. There was no room, no mercy. The crash wasn't loud. Not like in the movies. It was ugly, blunt. The crunch of metal surrendering, the snap of glass. A hiss, slow and final, of something broken. Gracie buckled, shuddered, then slumped to a lopsided stop. In the truck bed, apples spilled forward, bright, bruised orbs tumbling like marbles on a kitchen floor, scattering dreams and soil in every direction. Henry didn't move. His hands stayed wrapped around the wheel, knuckles pale, breath coming in careful pulls. A sting above his brow told him the windshield had left its mark. Blood dotted his temple like punctuation. He reached forward and turned the key. Gracie went silent. The world did too. Then the soft click of money, a luxury car door opening with the lazy grace of someone used to being waited on. Brandon Turlow stepped out. He didn't look at the damage. He looked at his sleeve, brushed off some invisible dust. 35, handsome, polished like showroom glass. The kind of man who never had to explain himself. His shoes gleamed like promise, like debt. They cost more than most folks in Westfield made in a week. He knew it. He wore it. He glanced at his Maserati, just a smudge on the fender, barely worth his attention. Then at Henry's truck, twisted metal, bent door, apples bleeding across gravel like spilled wine. "You all right, old man?" he called, like he was checking in on a weather report. "Didn't see you. These damn roads are too narrow." Henry opened the door. It groaned in protest. He stepped out slow, his boots crunching into the apple-freckled dirt. He didn't look at the man. His eyes went to the truck, his truck. Brandon strolled closer, hands tucked in his coat pockets. "Casual as you please." "This thing still runs?" he asked, tapping Gracie's hood like he was knocking on an old vending machine. Henry said nothing. Brandon chuckled, more to himself than anyone else. "You know, I collect vintage, real pieces. I could get this cleaned up, throw it in a showroom next to my '65 Mustang. Tell you what, 10 times what it's worth. Hell, I'll toss in a new Silverado while I'm at it." Henry finally turned his eyes toward him. Calm, quiet, steel. "She's not for sale," he said, voice steady. Brandon's brow lifted, like someone told him the sky was green. "Everything's for sale." Henry didn't flinch. "Not this." Brandon let out a low whistle, walking a slow arc around the truck, his gaze sliding over every dent, every rusted edge. "She's got character. I'll give you that," he muttered, crouching to inspect the damage. "But come on, be honest with yourself. It's just an old truck." The words hit like a slap in the cold. Henry didn't argue, didn't raise his voice, didn't correct him. He simply reached into the inner pocket of his coat. Henry reached into his jacket and pulled out something that made Brandon blink in disbelief. A flip phone, a battered relic from a long-gone era. Its corners had been worn smooth, its screen cracked like it had survived more than one fall. With practiced ease, Henry flipped it open and started dialing. Brandon let out a scoff, half chuckling, under his breath. "Who are you calling? The museum?" Henry didn't say a word. He just held the phone to his ear, calm as ever. Then, just before the line connected, he spoke. His voice was so soft, Brandon barely caught it. "It's time." He shut the phone with a quiet snap and slid it back into his pocket. The two men stood there, Brandon puzzled, his brows pulling together in annoyance and confusion. Henry, silent and unmoved. Around them, the wind rustled through the trees, sending a few fallen apples rolling across the gravel at their feet. The world was about to shift, and Brandon Turlow had absolutely no clue just how much. The phone hadn't even rung twice. One click, then silence, and then a voice one Henry hadn't heard in over 4 decades. "Granger." Henry closed his eyes. The weight of years pressed against his chest like a slow, rising tide. "It's me," he murmured. "It's time." A pause stretched across the line. Then the voice came again, older now, but steady and sharp. "Where?" Henry gave a name, a single street. The call ended. The flip phone closed with a final soft snap. It sounded like the last line of a chapter, like the closing of a vault. Henry slid it back into his pocket. He didn't say another word. He turned toward the old truck, Gracie, and gently laid a hand on her dented hood. His fingers traced the sharp crease along the bent fender and stayed there, resting, almost reverent. Brandon, a few feet away, shifted his stance, his unease growing with each second of silence. His brows furrowed. He stuffed his hands deeper into his coat pockets. Like that might help him hold on to the dominance he thought he had. "You just made a call," he said with a smug grin. "You think you were going to share me with some buddies from the VFU?" Henry didn't even blink. Brandon scoffed again, louder this time, and turned toward his Maserati. He brushed an invisible speck off the side mirror, already picturing the drive back to Boston, the calls he'd make to his insurance agent, the lunch reservations he could still keep. But Westfield had different plans. 15 minutes crawl by like molasses sliding down cold glass. Brandon paced. Henry stood like stone. The air thickened. It felt like the trees around them were holding their breath. Then it began. No sirens, no squealing tires, just a low rolling sound, like distant thunder bringing information instead of rain. Brandon looked up from his phone. At the end of the street, a convoy appeared. Black SUVs, sleek, tinted windows, engines rumbling low and steady like caged power. 6 of them, moving together like a single thought. No sirens, no government plates, no markings. Just presence. They didn't speed. They didn't blare music. They rolled forward as if the road belonged to them. Brandon straightened up, unease now creeping like frost into his bones. "What the hell?" he muttered. The SUVs came to a stop, perfectly aligned. Their doors opened in sync, no rush, no panic, a quiet, deliberate choreography. Men stepped out, all dressed in tailored black suits. No visible weapons, no badges or insignias, but everything about them, how they moved, how they stood, spoke of training, discipline, precision. From the lead vehicle, a tall man stepped out. Silver hair, broad shoulders. He moved like someone who'd once carried 40 pounds of gear through a war zone and never quite put it down. He wore no uniform. He didn't need one. Henry took a step forward. The man nodded once. "Granger." "It's been a long time," Henry replied, extending his hand. "Too long." They didn't shake like old friends. They clasped hands like soldiers, like men who'd once seen the same inferno and still carried the smoke in their lungs. Brandon stood frozen. His voice cracked through the tension. "Wait, what is this? Who are you?" The man turned to him. His gaze held something ancient and immovable. Brandon instinctively took a half step back. "We're the ones who remember," the man has said. "The ones who don't forget the debts we owe." Brandon blinked, his mind struggling to keep up. This is about that truck?" he stammered. The man's eyes narrowed. "That truck pulled 12 men out of a kill zone in Kandahar," he said, voice flat but heavy with memory. "Men who wouldn't be alive today if not for the guy who rebuilt it. Bolt by bolt, that's how he kept it alive. The man who drove it straight into gunfire because no one else had the guts to." Brandon turned slowly toward Henry. This time really looked at him, not as some wrinkled old man with a busted-down truck, but as something heavier, deeper. A man carved from the kind of silence that only comes after living through hell. "He's the reason I'm standing here," Alan said sharply. "The reason 12 families didn't have to bury their sons." The words hit like a gut punch. The silence that followed felt like everyone was holding their breath, like even the air recognized the weight of what had just been said. Henry didn't respond, didn't puff out his chest, didn't look for thanks. He just stood there, calm and steady. Behind him, the other men gathered in a quiet half circle around the old truck. No one laid a hand on it. They just stood guard, still as statues, like they were protecting something sacred. Brandon's voice came again, but it had lost its swagger. Now it was barely more than a whisper. "I didn't know." Alan gave a slow nod. "Most people don't. They forget, until something makes them remember." Brandon lowered his eyes, ashamed. Alan turned back to Henry. "You kept your promise," he said. "Now it's our turn to keep ours." His gaze moved over the truck, its twisted frame, battered body, every scar a welded memory. "We'll take her," Alan continued. "We'll make her whole again. But we'll leave the scars, just like you asked." Henry's eyes softened. "She's earned them." Then, with a quiet reverence, the men began readying the truck for transport. Not as a junk heap, not as a vehicle, but as a monument. Brandon took a step back, surrounded by a silence that wrapped around him like a heavy coat he couldn't shrug off. He'd come to buy something old. Instead, he found something priceless. And it changed him. As the last bungee cord was pulled tight across old Gracie's bruised frame, Henry stood off to the side. His hand rested gently on the truck's fender, like a father saying goodbye to a child heading off to war. His breath came slow and steady. In his eyes, there was no sadness, only memory. Alan Ree gave a sharp nod, and the men from the black SUVs moved with quiet purpose. Not a single motion wasted. No one spoke. No one tried to make a show of it. These weren't men doing a job. These were men honoring a vow. Brandon Turlow stood stiff near his Maserati. His arms were folded, not in pride, but as if to shield himself from something cold. But it wasn't the morning air that made him shiver. It was the weight of everything he hadn't understood, and worse, everything he had chosen to ignore. He watched as the battered truck was lifted onto the long trailer with care, almost ceremonially. No one barked orders. They moved like men who'd done this before. Maybe they had. Maybe this wasn't the first time they were called back to honor a man the world had forgotten. As old Gracie settled onto the trailer bed, the sun broke through the thinning fog. Light spilled across the road in soft golden sheets, catching the edge of the American flag now held firmly in Henry's hands, folded perfectly, cradled beneath one arm, like scripture. Alan stepped beside him. "We'll take her to Fairview Restoration, just outside Moliere," he said. "They'll handle the work carefully, exactly as you asked." Henry gave a silent nod. "She'll drive again," Alan added, his voice gentler this time. "She never stopped," Henry replied. Brandon finally found his voice. "Wait," he called, dry-mouthed. "You're just going to take it? Restore it? For free?" Alan turned to him slowly. "It's not for free. It was paid for a long time ago, with blood, with sweat, with a kind of courage that never cared about recognition." "But he's just a farmer," Brandon said weakly. "Maybe a mechanic? I don't even know. It's just a beat-up old truck." Alan's expression shifted. Not angry, just colder, icy. He stepped closer. "He's the reason 12 of my men lived past October 18th, 2002, he said flatly. "He patched that truck with his bare hands, drove it through a kill zone when our comms were down, and dragged us out, two at a time, while the desert burned around us. You want to call him a mechanic? Fine. But I call him the last man standing when every other soul had fallen." Brandon opened his mouth, but no sound came. His throat locked up, his breath stuck like a stone. Alan turned back to Henry. "We never forgot. Not one of us. It just took your call for us to come back." Henry nodded slowly. "I wasn't sure you'd remember the number." "I never erased it." Alan's voice cut through the quiet. "Not once." The men in black suits had finished their task of securing the old truck, but they didn't retreat immediately to their vehicles. Instead, they formed a line beside the trailer, not in military formation, not as part of some ceremony. They simply stood still, silent, present, like a small honor guard. Not for Henry, for the truck, for Gracie. One of them, a tall man with a streak of gray in his beard, stepped forward. He raised his hand in a crisp salute, not to the man who once drove her, but to the machine itself, to the service she had given, the burden she had carried, the weight of lives she once helped save. A salute to the quiet kind of courage that leaves no medals but plenty of scars. Then, without a word, the men began climbing back into the black SUVs. Their engines came to life, not with a roar but with a hum, quiet, confident, unshakable. Alan turned to Henry, resting a hand on his shoulder. "You'll hear from me in a week," he said. "Maybe less." Henry nodded, eyes on Gracie. "She'll come back, scars and all." Alan gave a small smile. "She wears them well." Across the lot, Brandon stood still. The weight of everything that had just unfolded seemed to crush his chest, pressing into him with the kind of gravity no one had ever prepared him for. He looked at Henry, at the men, at the truck, and then back to the ground. I didn't know," he muttered, his voice catching in his throat. Alan didn't stop walking as he passed him. "No," he said quietly, "but now you do." The convoy began to roll forward, slow and steady, the trailer nestled safely in the middle. The sunlight caught the chrome rims and the deep black panels as they moved. In Westfield, curtains shifted, doors eased open, and people came out, watching from sidewalks, porches, and windows. Hats in hands, brows furrowed. Not a single cheer, not a single clap. This wasn't a celebration. This was a reckoning, a silent gesture of respect. Henry stood alone as the last SUV disappeared over the ridge. The flannel on his shoulders stirred in the breeze, but the folded flag across his chest didn't move, not even a flutter. Brandon finally took a few tentative steps toward him. He didn't offer a handshake, didn't try to say the right thing. He just stood next to the older man, head bowed. His presence, for once, not about himself. Henry didn't glance his way. "You thought it was just a truck," he said, voice low. Brandon nodded. "I did." Henry's gaze stayed fixed on the horizon. It's not. And with that, he turned and walked away, leaving the younger man alone, no longer polished, no longer cocky, just quiet, just real. The town fell into stillness once more after the last vehicle vanished, but the air had changed. It felt heavier somehow, like something sacred had passed through and was still lingering. Leaves spiraled across the road, skimming the asphalt nervously. Brandon Turlow didn't move. His shoulders were squared, but the certainty, the arrogant assurance that had always followed him was gone. He didn't storm off, didn't reach for his keys or slam a car door. He simply remained there, rooted to the spot where the truck had once stood, as if even the ground remembered her weight, not just of steel and rubber, but of time, of memory, of meaning, of something larger than all of them. Henry didn't look back. He didn't need to. Some lessons are meant to be learned alone. 2 weeks passed. Then, just before dawn on a Tuesday morning, old Gracie came home. No cameras, no reporters, no grand reveal. Just quiet wheels easing over frost-tipped gravel, stopping gently in front of Henry's cabin as the horizon turned silver with sunrise. The men who brought her didn't knock, didn't wait for thanks. They just left her there. And on the dash, they taped a note. She's whole again. Her scars are still there, just like you asked. Alan. Henry stepped out onto his porch, a steaming mug of black coffee in hand. He didn't speak, he just looked. The truck gleamed softly in the morning light. The old dents were still visible. Buffed, yes, but not erased. The fender had been straightened, not replaced. The cracked leather on the bench seat had been stitched with care, not covered over. The scent of new engine oil lingered in the air. He opened the door, slipped into the cab. His wife's photograph was still tucked beneath the dashboard, right where it had always been. He sat for a long moment in silence. Then he turned the key. Gracie rumbled back to life, not loud, not flashy, just strong. The sound of survival, of something that had endured. By midday, word had already spread. Locals began to drive by, slow and respectful. Not to stare, not to ask questions, just to nod. Those small, solemn gestures that said, "We know now," that said, "We understand." And Brandon came back too. Not right away. But when he did, there was no flash, no showboating, no Maserati, just a rental truck, dusty from miles on the highway. He parked across from the diner where Henry always took his Friday lunch, and he waited. Henry stepped outside, the morning air crisp and quiet, and there stood Brandon, awkward and still near the sidewalk. No phone, no sunglasses, just a young man who looked like he'd come to say something that had taken him far too long to find the words for. Brandon took a step forward before Henry could even speak. "I didn't come to offer you money," he said plainly. "I came to thank you." Henry didn't reply. He simply tilted his head, the way a man does when he's heard too many empty words in his life and isn't sure yet if these will be any different. "I didn't get it before," Brandon continued, a trace of regret woven into his voice. "I thought I did. I thought it was just an old truck. But I was wrong. That truck, it's more than history. It's a promise, a home, a record of every mile that mattered." Still, Henry said nothing. He simply watched the younger man with those steady, weathered eyes. "You see it now?" he finally asked, voice even. Brandon nodded slowly. "I do. And I see you too, not as some old guy with a beat-up truck, but as the man who kept a promise no one else would have even known about, if you hadn't made that call." Henry sipped his coffee. "Funny thing about promises," he said after a moment. "They're quiet. They don't shout when you keep them, but they don't die when you break them either. They hang around." Brandon dropped his gaze to the ground for a second, then looked back up. "I started a fund," he said, "quiet him, anonymous, for restoring veterans' vehicles. Some of them don't even run. Some are just rusted out in barns, but they meant something. Still do." Henry gave a slow, thoughtful nod. "That's a good start." Brandon extended his hand. This time Henry took it. Not fast, not eager, but real, steady. That evening, Henry got behind the wheel of old Gracie. He took her down the winding back roads of Westfield, past the little white church with the peeling paint, past the open field where kids played football until the sun dipped too low. The cab smelled like oil, in memory, in apples. He didn't go far. He didn't need to. When the sun began its slow descent behind the line of trees, casting gold across the hills, Henry pulled over. He stepped out quietly. The gravel crunched beneath his boots. He reached into the glove box and pulled out the flag, still folded tight, still precise. He held it for a while, letting the silence speak. Then he whispered, "We kept our word, buddy. She's still rolling." For just a breath of a moment, time folded in on itself. The years didn't seem like distance anymore. And the quiet, it didn't feel empty. It felt full, alive. Because some promises don't get signed in ink. They're written in steel, in scars, in silence. And no amount of money ever taught that kind of lesson. Westfield never made national news. It wasn't that kind of place. No scandals, no flashing lights, just barns leaning into time, honest work done with calloused hands, and neighbors who still waved from their porches. But sometimes the stories that matter most never travel farther than the county line. That fall, Henry Granger became more than just the man with crates of apples in his truck bed. He became something else, something quieter but heavier. The keeper of memory. People didn't talk much about it, not at first, but they noticed. They noticed how Gracie rolled back down Main Street, not shinier, not flashy, but truer somehow, like she had settled into her bones, proud of her miles. Kids pointed when they saw her. "Is that the truck?" They'd ask their parents, wide-eyed. And the parents, well, they just nodded, not because they knew every detail, but because they'd heard enough to know it wasn't fiction. The pastor spoke about Henry in a sermon one Sunday, not by name, but everyone knew. "The strongest people in our lives often walk quietly among us," he said, "carrying burdens we'll never see until we're lucky enough to witness the weight of them." Henry never cared for praise. When folks tried to thank him, he'd just shrug and say, "I just drove a truck." But no one remembered that part. They remembered the call. They remembered the convoy. The silence that settled like reverence when 6 black SUVs rolled down the street, heavy with memory. And somehow everyone knew about the flip phone, that relic from a different time, and the voice on the other end, the one who hadn't forgotten. Brandon came back one last time, not with excuses. Those were already spoken. Not with money. He understood now that wouldn't do. He came with something different, a small brass plaque, simple, honest. He handed it to Henry one chilly Saturday morning, just as the first snowflakes started falling. Henry didn't speak. He read the plaque to old Gracie, voice low and steady. For every mile she carried the weight, for every promise she helped keep. From those who lived because you did. Henry didn't say a word, but he stepped back and he found a place on the truck, a spot where the brass could rest. And when he fastened it there with his own 2 hands, it was like the miles that had passed folded into the steel. The promise was no longer just remembered. It was seen, carved in metal, held in time. Inside the glove box door of the pen, Henry carefully screwed the plaque into place with his own hands. He positioned it right beside the neatly folded flag and the sun-faded photo of his late wife. It was a quiet, solemn moment, one of those acts done not for an audience, but for the heart. Brandon didn't linger after that. There were no goodbyes, no dramatic parting words. He got into a pickup truck, not a sleek Maserati like the one he used to flaunt, and drove out of town with a little less flash, but a whole lot more weight in his soul. Winter arrived gently in Westfield. Snow powdered the rooftops like sifted sugar, and children could be seen pulling sleds through the soft drifts, laughing as they carved trails through the white. Life slowed to its familiar, easy rhythm. Henry spent his mornings the way he liked them, coffee warming his hands as he sat on the porch, watching the world go by. Some days he drove into town just to wave at the passing school bus. Other days, he didn't drive at all. But now and then, when the ache of memory came calling, he'd take Gracie, his old truck, down the winding back roads. Not to go anywhere in particular, but just to listen to her engine hum, to feel the road beneath them, and to remember the long stretches of yesterday that still lived in the quiet between each mile. One evening, as the sky dimmed and the porch lights flickered on, a young boy from the local church approached Henry's porch with hesitant steps. "Mr. Granger?" he asked softly, almost afraid of the answer. Is it true your truck was in a war? Henry gave a low chuckle, the kind that came with years of living. She wasn't enlisted, he replied with a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. But she's been to a few battlefields. The boy's eyes grew wide. Did she really save people? Henry looked down at the flag resting gently in his lap. He paused, letting the question settle in his chest before answering. She didn't save anyone, he said quietly. She just got them to someone who could. The boy stood there for a moment, chewing on the thought. Then he nodded slowly, as if the meaning had just bloomed inside him. That's kind of the same thing, right? Henry's smile deepened, slow and full of something that looked a lot like peace. Maybe it is, he said. In time, the story of old Gracie became stitched into the fabric of Westfield. It wasn't told in parades, and it never made its way into textbooks, but it lived on in the way people started to see the old things with gentler eyes, in how promises began to feel sacred again. Kept, not bartered. Even the youngest among them began to understand something most adults forget. Not all heroes wear medals or drive shiny new cars. Some just keep going forward when no one else will. And in that small Vermont town, where snow fell as softly as memory, and the morning light filtered through windows frosted with time, Henry Granger lived out the rest of his days with calm in his chest and a truck in his driveway that no one would ever again mistake for just old. Because Westfield remembered, in a world that measures everything by price, where value is too often confused with cost, stories like Henry's remind us, not all that matters can be bought, and not everything worn has lost its worth. Gracie wasn't just a truck. She was a vessel, a keeper of memories, of silent sacrifices, of promises made with no need for applause and kept without fanfare. And maybe that's exactly the reminder we need in today's world of constant upgrades, quick trade-ins, and values that come with expiration dates. How many old trucks are we walking past in our own lives without truly seeing? Maybe it's a grandfather's fraying jacket still hanging by the door, a mother's recipe card stained with years of use, a neighbor who quietly sits at the edge of the church hall every Sunday without fail. Maybe we all know a Henry, and maybe, just maybe, it's time we stopped, looked, and listened before their stories slip away unnoticed. If this story touched something in you, if it reminded you of someone who carried strength not in noise but in quiet actions, please take a moment to show your support. Give this video a thumbs up, subscribe to our channel, share it with someone who might need to hear a story like this today. Thank you for spending this time with us. On this channel, we honor memory, kindness, and the silent heroes among us. Because sometimes it's the quietest stories that leave the deepest marks. We'll see you next time. Until then, keep your promises. And every once in a while, take the long road home.